and welcome to Holistic Medicine Chats.
Hi, I'm Dr. Armin Nicogosian.
And I am Rebecca Davila.
I'm a internal medicine doctor who practices functional integrative medicine here in Southern Nevada. And my journey started when my son Jonah was diagnosed with autism over 10 years ago. He pretty much changed my viewpoint on life and my professional career, and started me on the journey which has taken me to where I am now.
I got into the holistic medicine through my son, who was diagnosed with autism spectrum disorder, and I learned that there was ways to alleviate a lot of his symptoms. That was kind of like my driving passion in learning about this, so now I am going to school to be a holistic health practitioner. So we wanted to create this chat for families to have a resource to get information of how they could implement some of these things in their own life for better health and wellness.
These are some of the chats that Becky and I would have anyway. So we thought capturing them on video to share with others would be something that other families would find helpful.
So if there is a certain topic that you would like covered, please feel free to leave a comment. Thank you so much for watching.
We're just going to have a chat today about the most recent MAPS conference. I just got back from the Medical Academy of Pediatric Special Needs. They do a conference twice a year. This was their fall conference for 2019. And these conferences have been going for about the last 4 to 5 years. And every time I go, I always learn something new or get some new information. So we thought we would have a bit of a chat about it and share it with some of the audience, and maybe what we're talking about.
Want to explain like what a MAPS doctor is?
Yeah, so MAPS is the Medical Academy of Pediatric Special Needs. This is an organization that essentially was a successor to the old DAN, or Defeat Autism Now doctors, which was about 10 years ago. It kind of morphed into MAPS, which had still the same basic focus, which is a group of doctors who were focused on really finding the root causes for a lot of the developmental delays that we're seeing kind of at epidemic proportions in children today, particularly autism spectrum disorders. It's not limited to that, but I would say that's definitely the lion's share of the topics that we discussed there. So it's really just a meeting place for all of us a couple times a year where we get to chat, exchange ideas, talk about tough patients, and there's always a group of lectures that are involved there, and it's the lectures have definitely evolved over the years as we get better and better understanding. So like I said, it's exciting. Every year I'm always happy when I come back. I always get some great information from it.
So what kind of prerequisites are required to be a MAPS doctor?
So MAPS is open not just to doctors, it is also open to physician assistants, nurse practitioners, nutritionists. You have to be naturopathic physicians, holistic health providers. There's a lot of different areas that it's open. I think the key is that it's a health practitioner who's committed to helping children with developmental delays to get better. And that's really what I like about the organization. Is some of these organizations are very restrictive based on sort of education, but MAPS does see the benefit that all different kinds of practitioners bring to the table, and that really I think it makes the organization better, as far as the people that we're interacting with, and everybody brings a different viewpoint to the table, because in the end, as far as chronic diseases go, at least from my perspective, I really see autism as the holy grail of chronic diseases. If you can really crack that one and figure it out, pretty much all the other ones would be at least equal, if
it coincides with treatments for many other.
Absolutely. Especially a lot of immune disorders. We've seen a pretty large explosion in autoimmunity and allergy in the last 20 years, much more than we've seen in the past. There's a pretty large overlap with Alzheimer's and autism. They're different in many ways, but actually similar in a lot of key critical fields. So there's definitely a lot of overlap in terms of what we learn. The difficult part really is, coming back on Monday morning and then applying it to the patient. That can be
Right.
very challenging. Some of the lectures are definitely a lot more clinically based, some are a lot more theoretical, but they're all kind of bring something to the table. This year, fall 2019, every MAP session has what they call a plenary session, which is, because normally they have different tracks. They have like a metabolism, nutrition, neurology. You have to finish so many tracks in order to become a MAPS doctor. So they always have those going at the conferences.
And how many days is the conference?
3 days.
3 days?
Yeah, 3 full days. A lot of engagement, definitely a lot of engagement from the attendees. They always have a plenary session, which is a session where everybody kind of goes together. So, and every conference there's a different topic. One year it's genetics. This year in particular, it was basically the role of allergy and immune dysfunction in autism.
Which there definitely is such a need
Oh,
for
yeah.
more treatments and information on that.
Absolutely, they had some great speakers. They had Dr. Theo Harides over at Tufts University. He's kind of one of the lead researchers in the world on mast cell dysfunction, histamine release. He had a very interesting talk about the role of histamine and mast cells as far as immune function, or more specifically immune dysfunction in the brain, and how that's related to autism. We had another talk from Dr. Risto Vajani. He's a immunologist who's he's associated with Cyrex and Immunosciences Labs. His talk was about food intolerance and food allergies and how they're related in there. We had Sid Baker, Dr. Baker. He's sort of the the godfather of MAPS. He's been around a long time.
Is he here in the U.S.?
He is. He's out in Connecticut, I believe, or Connecticut or Long Island.
So how does this conference differ from Autism One? I know a lot of families are familiar with Autism One. We watch a lot of lectures. How is this different from that?
There's definitely a lot of overlapping speakers. The lectures themselves are geared specifically towards providers rather than parents.
Okay.
So the content, I would say, is very similar, but I think the level of where they go into the research and dissect it, I think is probably more at a provider level. I think, and I don't say that disparagingly towards the parent. I think
Right.
Autism parents are very well educated in what they're learning, but it's maybe not as pertinent for them as it is for us to understand what treatments we're executing, just so we have a background in it. And really, also from a practical standpoint, if something goes wrong, if you understand the background of why you're doing it, you can kind of, hopefully figure out what's gone wrong and try to fix it.
So it speaks more to like the anatomy and physiology, but behind why certain treatments work. And
especially the biochemistry, I think. They did a genetics day, this conference, which I had enrolled in. It was excellent. It was great. They kind of went over a lot of the SNPs that we always hear about. A lot of people will use YASCO as a reference for that.
And SNP stands for?
Single nucleotide polymorphisms. And SNPs are basically locations we've determined in the genome, which we don't call them mutations, we call them variations, but frankly that's just a terminology thing. If it's less than 1% of the population has it, it's a mutation. If it's more than 1%, it's a variation. The SNPs, there's a lot of good information on SNPs in terms of how they impact nutrigenomically, or how they impact through how the child would absorb his nutrition or utilize his nutrition, and how it could have impact on mito function, methylation function. But there's also a lot of SNPs where there's a lot of theorizing still. We don't have
And just because the SNP is there doesn't mean that it's active.
Exactly.
Okay.
Right. Well, there's two aspects. One is just the knowledge that we have of what the SNP does, because it's, we have a tendency to try to simplify everything to, this, does this, and that's the outcome.
It's like, what's the most common SNP that you see in children with autism?
MTHFR is a very common one. COMT is a very common one. MTR, MTRR, FOLR1.
VDR.
VDR is another one. I mean, there's a whole host of them. I usually start with MTHFR because it's so well studied.
Right.
And that has a lot to do with how efficient they are at processing methylation. But yeah, the genetics, genetics day that they had, again, was very heavy on the biochemistry. But again, it's every time we go over this, and genetics to me is the big code that we're cracking, right? And they started back in 2000 with the Human Genome Project, and it's just been kind of trudging along, and every year we have more and more information. There was a particular lecture by Dr. Bowles. He's a geneticist out in the Los Angeles area, and he's doing whole genome sequencing now in a lot of kids. Whole genome sequencing has gotten to the point where it's still expensive, but it's within the price range for a lot of people who afford it. You can get it done now for around $2,000 to $2,500. And I want to be clear on that that's actually, you have something called whole exome sequencing, which is that basically that 3 to 5% of the genome that we've identified as, that we use, and then we used to call the other 95% junk DNA, which is ridiculous. When you think about that, 95% of our genetic material will be garbage, right? So what they're finding now is that 95% is very involved in the regulation of the other genes, and as you said earlier, how they turn on or turn off.
Kind of work synergistically together.
There's a lot of area we don't understand on that yet, and it has a lot to do with epigenetics. Epigenetics is how the environment interacts with the genes, how it turns it on or turns it off, and that 95% of so-called junk DNA probably related to that regulation. So, but that's actually included in the whole genome sequencing. And what I find exciting about that is, if we're not running these on thousands and thousands of people, we never will learn what these areas do. So the fact that we now have relatively affordable, again I say that relatively, I mean $2,000 is still a lot for a test.
So if a parent wasn't able to afford to do that genome sequencing test, what would you recommend as a good starting point?
I used to recommend 23andMe a lot.
Mm-hmm.
The old 23andMe, the old version from 2 summers ago, had I think 9 or 9,500 SNPs, which for
they've removed a lot since then.
Yeah, the current version's about 2,500 or 2,000, which is still a decent number, but they took a lot of the additional ones out. They did maintain a lot of the ones we have a lot of knowledge about, like MTHFR and ApoE and those kind. There is a Bob Miller. He has an outfit called Functional Genetic Analysis. They actually now are offering a genetic kit which replicates the old 23andMe. Yes, for I'm not sure exactly on the price, but it's I believe around $200 or something.
Which is considerably cheaper than the other one for parents too. That
Absolutely.
Unattainable.
And I think that one is very focused in terms of if a parent had done a whole whole genome sequence. Of course, there would be a tremendous amount of information there, but the reality of it is probably greater than 99% of that data would just be sitting there until we learn more about how to interpret it. Right. Which is great because you don't necessarily have to do your genetic testing over and over. Once you do it, it is what it is.
Right.
But there would be a lot of information that, although it would be there, we wouldn't know what to do with it. Whereas with the SNP testing, we've been doing that for well over 5 years, in some cases even 10 years. We do have a fair amount of knowledge on it, and I think in my practice I find it very helpful as long as I correlate it clinically. If I see a SNP and I suspect that something may be amiss, if I can correlate it with a lab abnormality or a clinical abnormality, that reassures me that that SNP is being expressed, and with that case it can be helpful. What I don't recommend is basing a whole lot of decisions solely on genetic information,
right?
Because it just doesn't translate that way. And the one I hear the most is the difference in whether you should use methylated form of B12 versus the adenylyl or hydroxy.
Sometimes it should be trial and error because it might benefit them, but if they're going based solely on the genetics, they'll never know because they're not going to try it now.
Right. Right. Well, and a lot of our kids are depleted of methyl groups, so those methyl groups can be quite helpful. I mean, I wouldn't give it to a child who's adversely, he's hyperactive, bouncing off the walls. Okay, that's a sign.
There could also be an adjustment period of when starting these things where the kid needs to adjust to it. So I know for my son, when we started the methyl B12 injections, he was very emotional for the first few weeks, but then it subsided, and he started seeing gains from it. So I definitely think it's something worthy of giving a try.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. And there's nothing to say that you can't change out the formulation. I think today it's very hard to get adenosylcobalamin in injection form.
Right.
I have a difficult time finding pharmacies to do that.
You did find one in Hawaii that does it?
Not for that. They do a combination with folinic and NAC, which I like to use, in addition to the methylcobalamin. It's fairly easy to find a combination of methyl and hydroxycobalamin amongst the various compounding pharmacies. But yeah, adenosine, I'm not sure if it's a stability or a cost issue or what it is. It's tough to find. So if that's the type of B12 the parent is looking for, usually they have to go with a sublingual form, which in the younger kids or the lower functioning kids, they're going to probably swallow it.
Right.
Keep it under their tongue. So, and if there's a gut issue, B12 is...
What about topically?
Topically, I would say topically would be something to definitely try. I think there's variable absorption, and it's not clear why. I think it has to do a lot with variation of skin thickness, pigment in the skin. But I think potentially that would be an area to look into. But yeah, as it stands right now, we're kind of limited to the two forms. But to my original point was, I don't base that decision on the genomic information. In particular, Dr. Yasko put out sort of this warning years and years ago, but it was really a theoretical warning, and I tried to follow it for many years to see if I saw changes in the kids, and I really didn't. I mean, the ones who got hyperactive, they just got hyperactive. It seemed to be independent of what I saw in the genetics, so I don't know if that's necessarily a correlation. I think the most important thing is, if you're going to start your child on that therapy, just watch them, keep good notes, and don't be afraid to talk to your doctor and say, hey, look, I don't know if this is right for him. Maybe we got to change it, or decrease the dose, or increase the frequency, or there's
you
a lot.
You can have all the lab work in the world, and then you can go to implement it, and it just might not be a good fit.
Yeah, the best lab in the world is your child.
Right.
Just watching your child, and of course there's ups and downs from day to day. How children are. We all have our good days and bad days, but I always recommend you have the assumption that there's a cause if they're having a bad day. Don't assume it's just because. Maybe it is just because. It's possible, but always assume there's a cause. Look for patterns. As long as you have a good method of data collection, which I do recommend. When I did biomed with my own son years ago, I started. I would have periods of good data collection and periods of not. And the periods where I didn't have good data collection, I always thought I'd remember, and I never did.
Right.
It all blends together in our minds, and so don't overestimate your ability to remember.
Yeah.
So and it can be something as simple as a notebook or a spreadsheet. There's some great apps out there. I mean, there's lots of ways to do it.
Yeah.
Whatever works for the parent. Just make sure that they do that. But yeah, so I wanted to talk a little bit about the plenary session, which again, that was kind of the main focus of the conference this year. The plenary session was on allergy and immunity, and more specifically immune dysfunction or autoimmunity. And the reason that I think that the MAPS faculty had focused on having that day was, amongst the MAPS providers, many of us, and myself included, believe that majority of cases of autism have a very strong component of immune dysfunction, and you could even argue autoimmunity. The way an autoimmune diagnosis works in conventional medicine, you don't really have autoimmunity until you can put actual marker antibody and say, oh, that's positive, that's associated with this autoimmunity like lupus or rheumatoid arthritis. There's nothing like that yet in autism, but there's a lot of contenders for it. So we have a lot of potential ones. I could see in the future with more research potentially seeing those links with it. It's going to be difficult because, again, this gets to the basis of the autism diagnosis. It was originally put together as a psychiatric diagnosis based on behaviors. So from a pathological standpoint, we have a large diverse group of kids that all fall under that umbrella. So unfortunately, when it comes to studying it, that tends to dilute out any results that we would get, as opposed to if we were doing a study on diabetes, which diabetes is very clear. You need to have a blood sugar or hemoglobin A1C at a certain level. If you don't have it, you don't have diabetes.
Yeah.
We don't have a strict cutoff for that. It's just based on the behaviors. So, but even even with that barrier, I still think in the coming years, because we're seeing it more in the mainstream literature, I think it will be characterized primarily as that. So I think that once we have enough body of knowledge to have these antibodies identified, a large portion of them, I think it'll change our understanding of it, and then we'll start having more mainstream view of autism more as a medical condition or biomedical condition rather than strictly psychiatric one.
Right.
And as, like I said, it's coming around, I think, in the conventional literature. So the first lecture was from Dr. Theo Harades. He's an immunologist over at Tufts. He focuses mainly on mast cells and histamine and its role in autism and immune dysfunction. So with histamine, this includes the common things we see with histamine is allergies, asthma, rhinitis, eczema, food intolerance, food allergies. Those are kind of the classic things, and that's what any of us who get hay fever. The reason we have those symptoms is the histamine being released in the body. So we've known that for many years. He had some very interesting points in terms of it also has additional effects, and these are more severe patients who have something called mastocytosis or mast cell activation disorder, multiple chemical sensitivity. There's also histamine involved. I think the most interesting part of his lecture that I found was he showed a lot of research and data pretty much implicating histamine sort of as this immune gateway or immune regulator in how immunity works in the brain. We know now, and this is not new information, we've known this for many years, the microglia are very involved in what happens in autistic patients' brains. And the microglia are these immune cells that live in the brain. They basically hang out near the neuron and they do all the maintenance work around it. So the neuron can do its neuron stuff.
Neuron stuff.
Right, all the brain things it needs to do. But the microglia is like the handyman, and it takes care of growth and maintenance and inflammation. Well, the mast cell will use some different things like neurotensin and tryptase and histamine to actually talk with the microglia. So a lot of the regulation of the microglia is being regulated by the histamine, which is fine if you have normal histamine release, but if you have dysfunctional histamine release, how is that impacting the brain? So in particular, we're looking at these patients that, many parents will think of it as, just an allergy or just a bit of asthma, just a bit of eczema.
But there's more to it than just this.
Absolutely. So when you see that you have to think, well, my child has increased histamine. How is that impacting these microglia, these regulatory cells that are basically affecting the neuron, which is where the core issue is. They particularly found, go ahead.
How would it differ from like a neurodeveloping or a neurotypical child to a child with autism? What's the difference in how the histamine affects them?
We have today, in today's world, I would say more histamine issues than we've ever had, at least in my living memory. And I'm 48. I'm not young, but I'm not that old. So
you're pretty old.
Yeah, I'm pretty old. So old enough. So in my lifetime, I was born in 71. They didn't have peanut tables in school when I went to school.
Right.
I went to school in the 80s. We maybe had the one sickly kid in class who had eczema and asthma and a few things out of a school of a couple hundred kids or something like that. Whereas today we definitely have seen this massive explosion of peanut allergies, severe peanut allergies where they have peanut tables.
And what's contributing to that, you think?
Well, I think there's a lot of factors. I think we're messing with people's immune systems in a lot of ways. I think it has to do with our foods are very different. Genetically modified foods didn't exist on the mass scale before 1998. Now it's the majority of food that's in the grocery store.
Our air supply, our water supply, it's all a lot more toxic than it used to be.
Yeah, with the exception of lead, I would say for most toxins have gotten worse. The one thing I think the government's done a good job is cleaning up lead. They got rid of unleaded gasoline, back in the 80s. That's great, but as far as all the others, arsenic, mercury, aluminum in particular, they replaced the mercury with aluminum in vaccines in the early 2000s. which in some ways was better, but as from an immune activation standpoint, the aluminum probably activates the immune system more than the mercury does. And I think there may be other factors we're not aware of either. Like you were talking about the air, what is in our air? I mean, we've seen, we live here on the western part of the United States. There's a massive industrialization in China that's occurred since the 80s. They have coal-fired power plants, which they don't put scrubbers on their smokestacks, and there's mercury that comes out in those emissions, which the coal-fired power plants here in the United States have scrubbers on them, which limits that. In China, they don't, and we don't have any oversight over what they're expelling, but unfortunately, all that stuff goes, and the jet stream goes right over the Pacific, right onto the west coast of North America. I think there's a lot of additional factors that are
the Wi-Fi.
Right, Wi-Fi, that's a whole other subject. And that one's tough because it's hard for the health-based research to keep up with it because the pace of advancement on the functional side, right? They went from 3G to 4G to 5G.
It's going to be 10G next year.
Right, so as soon as they get a good handle on what's going on with it, they change the standard to something else.
And the research can't keep up with the current technology.
And that's, for me, that's a really big focus because I'm not one of these people that's out there trying to ban Wi-Fi because it's, I think, an integral part of our society now. I don't see it going away. I think we need to change our viewpoint on it more like car exhaust. Nobody talked about banning cars in the 60s when they saw smog in LA where you couldn't see the mountains. What they did was they put emissions on it. They put emission controls, they made the gas cleaner, and Southern California is a perfect example. The air is cleaner now in Southern California than it was in the 70s. I think if there was just more of a, rather than this discussion of, get rid of it versus don't do anything with it.
How can we protect ourselves more from it? Right,
and just maybe find certain frequencies that are less damaging to tissue, or just education on, don't have your router right on your computer if you're going to spend 8 hours working and it's 2 feet away from you.
Don't have it in the room with your child where they're sleeping.
Right. Keep it away from the bed. I usually recommend 10 to 20 feet if possible, and remember that includes ceiling to floor. It goes right through walls unless you have a metal wall, which most houses don't. But yeah, I think those kind of discussions I think are more realistic and more fruitful because it's here to stay and it's quite useful, to be frank with you. So I think if we just find safer ways of using it. But so all these factors, and like I said, we could probably easily spend an hour just talking about that. There's so many potential things, but the reality of it is, the kids being born today aren't genetically any different than kids being born 30 years ago. Why are we seeing all these issues, right? And in the original question was, how does the histamine affect, say, a neurotypical child? It does affect them. I think it's just not as dramatic.
And you're not just talking about like seasonal allergies. It could be food sensitivities. That set off an immune response.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Food allergies and intolerances are definitely included there. There's a pretty broad spectrum of how food can affect it, but definitely one of the ways is through histamine. So as he went through sort of the research and the things that he's been working on, he found that there were, in addition to those disorders, there's mastocytosis, mast cell activation, multiple chemical sensitivity, a lot of other disorders that are involved with histamine. And in particular, the histamine has a role in the brain as a neurotransmitter and also an immune mediator. And it works in addition to neurotensin and tryptase by activating or speaking with microglia. The microglia are the cells inside the nervous system that are the maintenance cells. They take care of the neuron. They sort of keep the neuron clean and they detox it, they help build it, they kill old ones, they do all the maintenance work so the neurons can do all of their neurological signaling.
Kind of manage everything.
Exactly. So the neurons are very specialized in what they do, and they can't really put the resources aside for maintenance, so they have a special cell that does that. Well, histamine is one of the things that talks to those microglia, and when they talk, they basically tell them to activate, which is not a good thing in a child who has neuroinflammation or inflammation in the brain. So a lot of the strategies that he looked at was getting that sort of histamine under control, and there was different methods. There was medications, there was supplements, there was diet. I'll kind of get to the treatments a little later. And he had some interesting tidbits. He had talked about, they showed a study that actually showed extracellular mitochondrial components basically would increase inflammatory mediators, which would increase mast cell activity, which increases histamine.
And what is the source of these extra mitochondrial components?
So a lot of our kids have mitochondrial dysfunction, where the mitochondria are not functioning to the level that they should be. And this sort of came from the work of Bob Navio. He's a researcher at UC San Diego. He developed this theory called the cell danger response several years back. And there's been more and more research supporting this theory. So, in my opinion, I think he's going to be supported in this as they get more research. But essentially, the mitochondria have an M1 and M2 phase. The M1 phase is where it produces energy, does what it's supposed to do. The M2 phase is where it detects something is wrong. That's what he calls the cell danger response, where it's sort of like danger, danger. And it starts producing inflammatory mediators instead of energy. So you get a decrease in energy production. And then on top of that, the inflammatory mediators are creating inflammation, which costs energy. So
Right.
you get a net decrease in energy, which, if that happens in an adult, you can see some brain fog, some chronic fatigue. But if that happens in a child who's 12, 13, 18 months old, most of that energy production is to developing that brain.
Right.
Because there's a lot of development that has to occur. So that's really where I think it's a very valuable target, especially in
So it's detrimental to neurodevelopment.
Absolutely.
Okay.
I mean, it's probably, arguably, I'm sure there's exceptions, but definitely, if not the biggest user of energy in that age group, it's absolutely in the top three, no doubt. I think it's the biggest user, probably.
And when you're saying energy, that's also referred to as ATP?
Mm-hmm. ATP is the chemical that the mitochondria make, and when they cleave this, it's basically got 3 phosphate groups. Every time you cleave it, energy is made. But yeah, so it's like a biochemical form of, wood or gasoline, or it's something we would use in our cars or a fireplace or something. But it's the same, and that's essentially why we need food, oxygen, and water. There's a lot of reasons why we need food, oxygen, and water, but one of the key ones is the mitochondria need all three to make the ATP, to produce the energy, to make everything else work. So in that M2 phase, that cell danger response, those mitochondria tend to be more fragile. They tend to die. They tend to release their DNA contents more. And naked DNA is something the body does not like at all. The immune system responds to it because it looks like other things. It can look like a bacterial infection or a viral infection, so it responds to it.
You just see an intruder floating around and they're like, no, we need to get this out of there.
Right. Yeah, and that's, so it's doing, probably what's appropriate, but it's, it's a bit mistaken. And so he linked that with that increased histamine response, which, and I think that's the key to really look for, is when there is that histamine response in a kid, not just to think of it as a mediator of allergies, it can be affecting the child's behavior and their neurodevelopment and everything else. Maybe it isn't, but there's a lot of evidence supporting that it is. And like I said, even in neurotypical kids, we see an element of that. Not as dramatic or drastic as we see in autistic kids, but most kids, when they're in the throes of hay fever season, or they're having an asthma exacerbation, they're not going to feel great. They're not going to do as well in school. They're not going to want to play as much. It makes the kid just kind of want to, kind of lay down with his tablet or his video game and watch YouTube. It's less lazy, right? Which is fine if you feel sick.
Right.
It's understandable. So I think the impact really goes beyond our kids on the spectrum. I think there's a lot of implications in Theohardy's research. He has a great website, actually, for people that are interested in kind of digging into the deeper into the research. It's mastcellmaster.com. He's got most of his research referenced. And Theohardy's, he's been published in the New England Journal. This great review article on mast cells and histamine. I think it was published about 5 or 6 years ago. So a lot of good literature put out by this guy.
So did he work with Bob, I don't know how to pronounce his last name, Navio?
Oh, Navio, right.
Yeah, they did a study a few years ago at Duke University, was it? And can you tell us a little bit about that and how it correlates with the research being done now?
I don't.
With the Sermon?
Oh, the Sermon one, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know if Theohardy's was involved in that one or not, but the So Dr. Navio had a study where they used an old medicine, basically an orphan drug called suramin, and it used to be used for African sleeping sickness, back in the 1900s.
Which is derived from a parasite, is
exactly.
that correct? Okay.
Right. So it's got antiparasitic action to some degree. What they found basically, so he had his theory about the M1 and M2 and how do we get that mitochondria to go back to that M1 phase. So he theorized that suramin, based on its chemical structure,
quiets that cell danger response.
and just gets it to kind of revert back. And the study they did was, it was under 20 or 25 kids. I think they were up to 14 or 15 years old. The results were quite impressive. I mean, there was really good response. So the suramin, he theorized that it would get the mitochondria to shift back to M1, and the initial results were very promising. The orphan drug suramin itself, the FDA banned it right around the time of that study, so there hasn't really been a lot of kind of grassroots experimentation with it, which we see a lot of in the biomed community because you don't always have the data to support it. There's talks of pharma getting involved in this and developing, basically rebranding suramin into something else. So we're just really waiting on that. Currently you can't get suramin anywhere. You can't get it compounded. You can't get it.
Are they looking into studying it further, or not right now? There's no talk.
Well, if pharma is going to develop it, they have to. So there's FDA has some pretty stringent rules on safety studies, and they have to do animal studies. And the fact that it was already approved for something else, which should streamline it through. We're talking. It's been about 3-4 years since that. Almost 5 years since that study.
Which is unfortunate if it's helping kids that it's not available.
Yeah, well, it's been frustration on many of our parts. I mean, I'd love to give my son a go on this one, but can't get it.
Yeah, where to find it?
Yeah, but again, if it's as effective as it looked in that initial study, and initial studies can be sometimes deceiving. It doesn't always mean it's going to necessarily be effective, but with those initial results, at the very least, we need to get a follow-up study. So that's sort of still on the horizon somewhere, hopefully sooner rather than later as all our kids get older.
Yeah.
So that's a very promising thing. So histamine, has a role in all these things. He talked about some labs that he likes ordering. They're different interleukins and different inflammatory mediators, which I found interesting. I ordered a lot of them. There's one in particular called Granzyme, which I don't really use very much, but I think I'm going to start using it. He states that it was very useful for repetitive or recurrent infections, such as like PANS or PANDAS.
Which is growing popularity fast.
Absolutely, yeah. And I think the incidence of that is, I think it's broader than people realize. I think most importantly, I think PANS and PANDAS is also a spectrum disorder, like all disorders, where you can have mild cases, moderate, or severe. When a disease is first characterized, everybody focuses on the severe presentation because that's what people notice. But that doesn't mean you can't have lighter presentations of it, which, especially in a child on the spectrum, even a mild case of it can be a significant contributor to disease. Where, in a neurotypical kid, it might be sort of a minor thing where he's maybe a little edgy or anxious, or maybe a little bit of poor handwriting. In mild cases, I want to be clear here, severe PANDAS, even in a neurotypical child, can be debilitating.
Right.
But in an autistic child, even a milder degree can have, I think, a significant impact. We don't have, because it's primarily a clinical diagnosis, it's very, very hard to diagnose it in a child on the spectrum. And usually the treatment is long courses of antibiotics, sometimes long-term prophylaxis. So, the treatment isn't something that you would lightly go into.
Or even like IVIG treatments I've been seeing children get.
Yep, IVIG can be effective, but it's, not a risk-free treatment. Things can happen with it. So that's an area that I think is definitely could use. If we could have some kind of lab marker to help direct our way on that.
There's the Cunningham panel. How efficient is that in determining?
Cunningham panel I think is very good for determining if the child has autoimmune encephalitis. The problem is most kids on the spectrum have that to some degree, right?
So it should just kind of be assumed.
Yeah, like particularly the antitubulin is one of the components of the Cunningham. I've never seen it not be positive on a kid on the spectrum. Now the other ones I've seen plus minus, depends. But so there's aspects of it that I think are just positive in all kids. I still think it's a useful. I think in neurotypical kids it's a very helpful
Does
test.
the time of when you perform the test make a difference in the results? Like if a child's in a flare-up of symptoms versus doing
Yes.
well, will
Yeah.
that alter the results?
Yeah, I mean, I think you want to try and catch them where those antibodies are going to be the highest, so you can. The last thing you want is an equivocal result, like something that's not negative, not positive, because we see a lot of that in autism, where it's like.
You spend all this money on this test, you want to get a definitive answer.
And you spend $900 and your answer is maybe, which is what it was before.
Right.
Yeah, you definitely don't want that. You want a yes or a no. So,
Right.
So yeah, I think definitely waiting for a flare, it can be helpful. But again, that's for me in my practice. That's one of my bigger challenges is trying to diagnose that in the autism population. He also talked about connections with SIRS. Chronic inflammatory response syndrome, which a lot of people know is a component of that is mold toxicity, right? Or chronic Lyme is another.
And for those unfamiliar, it's CIRS, not
Right.
Sears, like
Right.
Dr. Sears.
Right, CIRS. And this has been very well characterized by Dr. Shoemaker, who kind of brought this to everyone's attention. He's done a lot of work in the last 20 years on this. I think there's definitely a subset of autistic kids that have this, and we don't have any really good solid numbers, but just anecdotally from what I've seen, I think it's definitely higher than this 10 to 15% of the general population. That's what they state is a general number for it. I think it's higher than that, but again, this is another area that I think is another contributor, and again, histamine's involved, which is Dr. Theohardy's point, is like, look, this histamine character gets involved in all these things, so if we can't necessarily get behind the root cause, which is what we're always trying to do, at the very least we can try to tamp down some of these intermediaries which are creating a lot of the symptoms. I'd mentioned earlier it was neurotensin histamine tryptase that helped the mast cell talk to the microglia. He had quite a few literature articles on neurotensin levels, and they'd shown neurotensin levels are elevated in autism. And there's a link with CRH hormone, which is your cortisol responding hormone. That's the hormone your brain makes to tell your adrenals to turn on. It's kind of, a lot of people are familiar with TSH for thyroid.
Right.
That's the hormone that the brain makes to tell the thyroid to turn on. Well, there's one also for...
They kind of work, the thyroid and the adrenals kind of work together because they're all part
Absolutely.
of the endocrine system.
Right. There's I won't get into the weeds here with the different types, but there's like ACTH or CRH, but essentially it's important in adrenal function. The other thing neurotensin does is it actually stimulates mTOR. mTOR is this system in our body. mTOR stimulates growth in our body. And whenever mTOR is turned on, autophagy turns down. So mTOR is growth, autophagy is sort of the cleanup crew, the maintenance
Okay.
crew, right? So anytime you have growth, you're going to have a decrease in sort of the cleanup and the maintenance. Now there's controlled growth, a child growing, that's normal. So you don't want to shut this down, of course.
Right.
But when that growth gets out of control, and one of the things we know that happens in autism around the age of 2, we don't see as much pruning in the neurons, right? The neurons will expand to this large amount. A lot of kids on the spectrum have larger heads than their neurotypical peers up to age of 2 or 3, and then it normalizes. Well, part of what happens is there's a lot of pruning that happens at the age of 2. Many neurons are pruned and destroyed that the body feels it doesn't need anymore. And that's why most of us have really no recollection before the age of 3 or 2. And very few of us have memories of it. When you talk to some kids on the spectrum that have recovered or at least can speak enough to communicate, some of them do have memories that go back to like 9 months
That's
or 6
crazy.
months, which is very...
I can't even remember what I did last week.
Right. Some of their memories are incredible. And it sounds like neurotensin may be involved in that, because what it does is it stimulates that mTOR, which stimulates the growth and stops the cleanup, which is the autophagy, which is responsible for part of the reason. I shouldn't say it's responsible for it. It contributes to the pruning process. So that I think that's another aspect there. He had also mentioned exosomes and microvesicles in autism. This is actually a really, really interesting field. They're doing a lot of research on this right now in Alzheimer's. They found that patients with Alzheimer's have these exosomes floating around, and within the exosomes are DNA fragments, mitochondrial DNA fragments of infectious diseases, viruses, Lyme, strep, I mean, you name it. There used to be this idea, what I learned in med school was the brain is sterile.
Right.
That's probably not true. Now, obviously doesn't have the load of microbes that you would have in your gut or on your skin. That's not the case, of course, but it's not sterile. There are microorganisms there in much smaller amounts, but they're there. And we think that these microvesicles or these exosomes may be one of the ways that it travels there through the blood-brain barrier. There's still work to be done on that. In this particular study, they found that the exosomes and microvesicles in autistic patients contained mitochondrial DNA. So we're getting back to this DNA fragment thing turning on the immune system. So, why is all this mitochondrial DNA floating around?
And what you're saying is that it can actually travel through the blood-brain barrier, through exosomes?
Right, through exosomes and microvesicles. And where is all this mitochondrial DNA coming from? I mean, there's always going to be some turnover of mitochondria on a normal. That's part of the reason we have to sleep, is we have to recycle these every night. So there'll be some degree of that, but there seems to be more in kids on the spectrum. So, which again comes back to supporting this whole cell danger response idea that Bob Navio had. And anyway, these mitochondrial DNA fragments, once they get inside the brain, stimulate the microglia. And again, we've got microglia stimulation, creating inflammatory mediators, swelling. So again, we're just looking for more tools or more pathways to try to regulate this, to get those microglia to just calm down. Because that's...
So we don't want to stop it altogether. We still need that immune response and that inflammation.
Right. And there's probably some degree where I think it would probably be impossible to stop. And this comes down to another kind of aspect that I like to talk about in my patients, is particularly if there was like a traumatic birthing, like forceps or backing or something like that. You got to remember that the brain does have something called lymphatics, which is it's like lymphatics only with a G, right?
Right. And that's the brain detoxification.
Right. And this is only recently discovered a few years ago. This was something theorized by the osteopaths for many, many years, and that they would be big proponents of craniosacral therapy, and they would say it was to help detox the brain, because they said that the detox pathways were back here, and they could be actually, your lymph vessels can be kinked, they can be blocked, and if they're blocked, your brain doesn't detox at night. Well, I learned in med school in the 90s there was no lymphatic drainage in the brain, which I always thought was weird because it was everywhere else in the body. We just never found it. Well, they found it a few years ago, and they found it actually drains in the area the osteopaths have been talking about for years.
I've also read too, liposomal melatonin is another way to detox the lymphatic system. Right.
Yeah. Melatonin is a very potent antioxidant. Actually, it's got in addition to the effects it can have on sleep and circadian rhythm.
Which is normally what you only see advertised for, is just for sleep, but it does so much more.
Right. They have some studies out actually where they were dosing cancer patients extremely high doses of melatonin, 50, 75, 100 milligrams, which I want to be clear, this was purely experimental stuff. That's a very, very, very high dose of melatonin. I have no idea the safety profile of that. I think it's a very safe supplement in normal doses, half a milligram, 1, 3, maybe even up to 10 in some cases, but they were not trying to get anyone to sleep or overcome their jet lag or anything like that. I mean, they were actually looking to see what was the antioxidant effect. And it was potent. It was a pretty strong one. So I think melatonin is going to be one of these compounds that, as we learn more about it, we'll see that it has many functions, which is true of most things. Our body is so conservative by nature, And whoever developed us or whatever developed us was brilliant. I mean, just all these things that we do, most of the compounds that we make in our body it's very rare that they have one function. And if they do, it's probably not true. It's probably just our lack of knowledge.
Hasn't been studied yet.
Exactly. We know one function, but a good example is like thyroid hormone. We always talk about T3 and T4. But what about T1 and T2?
Right. And see, I've never even heard of anyone discussing.
They're there, but we don't know what they do, so we just sort of like, oh, well, that's not too important. Let's move on to the ones we know about. But it must do something, right? It's probably not just a precursor. It must have other effects. So many of these things, and this is where it gets complicated when we start manipulating these things, because it can have impacts on things we're not aware of. And that's where I always fall back to, your kid's the best lab. If something is not agreeing with them, unless it's something where the doctor said, look, they might have a rough time for a week, you got to kind of ride it out. You know, if they've kind of helped you anticipate that. You know, always watch how they're responding to it, because even something that, you know, the parents, you know, talk to friends or colleagues or whatnot, and they said, oh, this is so great and it helps everybody. Every kid is different.
Yeah, if someone says it helps everyone, run from that doctor.
Nothing helps everybody.
No.
So, just always realize that, you know, your child is
unique.
He's unique in how he does it. You know, you got to start somewhere, but always listen. It's challenging, we say, because a lot of our kids are, even the ones that are verbal, that, you know, they're still limited in what they can express. And for the nonverbal children, it can be very difficult trying to figure out how they're feeling.
And a lot of their communication is through behavior.
That's right.
So.
That's right. And some of these bad behaviors are, you know, you have to determine what's a behavior versus what is he's just not feeling good.
Right.
There's a difference, and it can be challenging sometimes. And, you know, especially if it's not the primary caregiver, if it's some new person at school or a new therapist, they may not know the child very well. So
you might just think that they're being naughty, or.
Right. And sometimes they are.
Yeah.
I mean, because there's autism or not, they're still kids, and they're gonna find it funny to push the envelope. But,
right.
You know, and that's.
I have one of those that loves to push the envelope.
Right. You know, take it in good humor, I guess, as long as, you know, they're not breaking anything or hurting themselves or something. So yeah, I guess to summarize, the Dr. Theohardy's, the point basically of his presentation was that mast cells are the immune gate to the brain, in his opinion. And he has a pretty good amount of evidence to support that. You know, he got into the treatments a bit. The treatments were, from a supplement standpoint, were mostly the flavonoids, which were quercetin, luteolin, methoxyluteolin. He's personally done a lot of research on that. He's actually the chief scientific advisor of, puts out Neuroprotect, which is a product that has, it has luteolin and quercetin. And the main advantage of it over some of the other products is the absorption is better.
Okay.
Quercetin doesn't absorb well through the gut. You know, if you take a large dose of it, you're lucky if you get 10-15% absorption. So the way he formulates it, it absorbs better. We've had some good luck with it, with that product. You know, he put out some cautions on quercetin dosing. You know, if you go beyond 1 gram, you can have some impact on liver enzymes. If your child is COMT positive, definitely double positive or even single positive, be careful, because
and that's where those SNPs or SNP testing can be helpful.
And that's a SNP, you know, kind of a SNP example that I have seen supported in my practice. When I give quercetin to kids that are COMT, either single positive or double positive, they go very hyperactive.
Okay.
So,
which is a side effect most parents do not want.
Right, exactly. It's a lot of sleepless nights. So,
yes.
So just be careful with that. I wouldn't say that's necessarily the reason to not use it, but just be aware and maybe just go very cautiously on the dose. And I mean, my recommendation always is, you know, a lot of this stuff's over the counter. I would really, you know, get a professional on board who's familiar with this to assist you with it. There's so many different interactions that can happen. You know, a lot of times there's this false sense of security. You can just buy it online. I'll just follow the directions on the bottle. I think it's, you know, maybe with 1 or 2 supplements, probably when you start
getting to vitamin C
when you start getting to 10, 11, 12, 15, there's the amount of interaction starts becoming very hard to keep track of, and then you don't know what's this doing versus this, or is this involved? So, you know.
And that's something I think a lot of parents don't keep in mind is like, yes, this on its own might be safe, but how is it interacting with the other 20 different things you're giving?
Right. And a lot of the supplements that are over the counter here in the US, like a good example, like alpha lipoic acid it's a prescription in Europe. It's called theotic acid, basically.
Oh, wow.
So
I hope they don't make it a prescription here.
Yeah, I don't think they will.
Okay.
But you know, just realize that it's, you know, we had the Supplement Act that they passed in '92, which helped the industry really blossom. So we have this big variety here in the U.S.
Right.
And it's good. I think it's a good thing. You know, I think on the downside of that is there's been this sort of
irresponsibility.
Yeah, and also a block on the part of, in some cases, where, you know, some of them maybe it wouldn't be unreasonable to make the prescription.
Right.
I don't think they should for the majority of them, but I think just having, I think the most important point is, I guess, for the parents to have a healthy respect for what some of these supplements can do metabolically.